Hi, welcome to my tutorial on using locking stitch markers to keep your crochet edges straight. I'm going to start by showing you how it works with single crochet, and then I'll do some double crochet since it's a little different. Alright, so I have just crocheted 5 single crochet stitches with a turning chain at the beginning of the row. Now I'm going to turn and go back the other way. When you are starting a new row, you want to always use your stitch marker to mark the first stitch that is going to count as stitch 1 in that row. So in this situation, I'm going to do a turning chain that is not counting as a stitch. Now I'm going to do my first single crochet after I turn my work. That's the stitch I want to have count, so that's where I add the stitch marker. So when you're about to do that first stitch, you pause. I like to loosen up my live loop a little bit so I don't lose it, because I'm going to take my hook out. Then I'm going to pick up a locking stitch marker that's closed, and I'm going to put it over top of that live loop, just like so. Then I'll put my hook back inside, snug it back up, and then find my first stitch location, which is right there. And just a word about this locking stitch marker, sometimes it can turn around on you and get in your way and block your view. So you just want to push it to the back, keep it out of the way. Its job is just to mark this space here between the live loop on your hook and your working yarn. So just let it hang out of the way and then go ahead and work your first single crochet. And you can see that when you finish the stitch, that stitch marker is now embedded inside the first single crochet. It's not marking the turning chain, it's marking stitch number 1, my first single crochet. And that way, when I come back the other way, I'll know when it's time to stop, and I'll know exactly where to work my last stitch. And that's how I'll be able to keep my edges straight. Now, the other way of doing it, if you don't want to take your hook out and put the loop on before you do the stitch, is you can put it in after you've done your stitch. So I didn't do one down here. So what you would do if it's after the fact is you just open it up like this, find both legs of that stitch that you're wanting to mark, and go ahead and insert the stitch marker underneath the legs. I just find that method is a little more awkward. You need both hands for it, and I prefer the way that I showed you here. That's the way I always teach in my classes. So now I've got, when you're working flat and you're wanting to keep your edges straight, it's going to look like this, where you've always got a stitch marker in the first stitch of the row you're working on, and then also a stitch marker in the first stitch of the row below, which is now going to be your last stitch. So then you can just crochet across. And this is really nice for big projects like blankets, where it's a real pain to have to count your stitches at the end of every row. Using your stitch markers helps you stay on track, so you know that you have the right number of stitches without having to count every time. So here I am at the last stitch with the stitch marker in it. There's the turning chain over here that can make this whole thing a little bit muddy, a little hard to read. And so the stitch marker is telling me that I'm at the last stitch, so I can put my hook in there, work my last stitch. Now, once you've done the last stitch, that stitch marker has done its job. You can take it out, close it back up, and just repeat. So chain 1, turn, take your hook out, move the stitch marker up here, snug the loop back up, and then work your single crochet stitch number 1, and now the stitch marker is marking it. Now I'm going to go to the end of this row, and then I'm going to switch to double crochets so I can show you the difference. Okay, so here I am at the last stitch. You may find that the stitch marker takes up so much space that it's harder to get your hook into that last stitch. If that's the case, you go ahead and take it out. It's done its job of telling you that that's the last stitch. It's like a stop sign. That's where you want to stop. And I'm keeping 5 stitches per row with the help of my stitch markers. Now for double crochet, The beginning of your rows is a little different because you're going to do 3 turning chains, and those are going to count as your first stitch. So we're going to use our stitch marker a little differently in this situation. So chain 3, but chain number 3 is where we want our stitch marker. So what you're going to do is you're going to chain 2, and then the same principle applies, that you pause before you do the stitch that you want to have marked. I'm about to do the stitch I want to have marked, the 3rd chain. So I pause, take my hook out, close up the marker, put it over the loop, put your hook back in, then do chain number 3. And now the stitch marker is embedded in that 3rd chain, marking the chain 3 as the first stitch of the row. Then you turn your work, and because those chain 3 are counting as the first stitch, we're pretending that it's a double crochet coming out of the first stitch. We're going to skip that stitch and we're going to work our first double crochet right there. And just continue across. And I'll know that I've come to the end of my row when I get to the stitch that has the stitch marker in it, right there. And that is all there is to it.